The snow blanketed the small homestead as Theodora Nelson stepped away from the doctor, who had just delivered the most devastating news of her 23 years. Her hands trembled, clutching her shawl tighter around her shoulders as the bitter cold of Colorado's winter bit at her skin, matching the icy despair spreading through her heart. It wasn't the fever that had nearly claimed her life last month that broke her spirit today. It was the single word the physician had used with clinical detachment. Barren. Rico, Colorado in 1883 was no place for a woman without purpose, and in the eyes of many, a wife unable to bear children had lost her most essential value. Theodora Thea, to those who loved her, had married young with dreams of filling her humble home with the laughter of children. Now, at the threshold of her small cabin, she watched the doctor's wagon disappear down the snow-covered path, taking with it the future she had imagined for herself. Inside the cabin, Thea moved mechanically, stoking the fire in the hearth without truly seeing the flames. The walls that once felt cozy now seemed to close in around her, each handmade item a reminder of what would never be. No tiny socks to darn, no cradle to rock, no little hands to hold. The small table where she and Richard took their meals would never need expansion. Richard. Her husband of 5 years. How would she tell him? The thought made her stomach twist. As the son of one of Rico's founding families, there were expectations. Continuation of the Nelson name meant everything to his parents. Thea had barely registered the sound of boots on the porch when the door swung open, bringing with it a gust of frigid air and the tall figure of her husband. Richard Nelson stomped his boots, his face reddened from the cold, unaware that his wife's world had shattered hours before. "Nearly froze my backside off fixing that fence line," he grumbled, hanging his coat on the peg by the door. When Thea didn't respond with her usual playful comment, he finally looked at her properly. "What's wrong? You're pale as the snow out there." "The doctor came," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard's expression shifted immediately from exhaustion to concern. "Are you still sick? I thought the fever had passed." "It has," she answered, unable to meet his eyes. "But there were complications." Richard crossed the room in 3 strides, taking her hands in his. They were rough and calloused from years of ranch work, but always gentle when they touched her. "Thea, whatever it is, we'll face it." Her eyes burned with unshed tears. "I can't have children, Richard. The fever. It did something to me. The doctor says I'm barren." The word caught in her throat like a jagged stone. Richard's face remained unchanged for several long moments, processing her words. Then, with a tenderness that made her heart ache, he pulled her against his chest. "You're alive, Thea," he murmured into her hair. "That's all I ever asked when you were burning up with fever, just for you to live." The dam broke then, and Thea's sobs filled the small cabin. She clung to her husband as though he might disappear, might realize in that moment that she was no longer the woman he had married. "Your parents," she managed between sobs. "The Nelson name, hang the Nelson name," Richard said firmly. "I married you, not the possibility of children." But even as he held her, Thea could sense something in his embrace, not disappointment, but a subtle grief. A mourning for something that would never be. She knew her husband well enough to recognize when he was being brave for her sake. In the weeks that followed, Richard was true to his word. Not once did he mention children or express regret for their childless future. But Thea noticed the way his eyes lingered on the Jeffreys' newborn when they visited town for supplies. She saw how he turned away when his younger brother announced that he and his wife were expecting their 3rd child. The whispers started in early spring. Thea heard them in the general store, felt the pitying glances from the church ladies. "Poor Richard," they would say, not quite quietly enough, "stuck with a barren wife. The Nelson line ends with him." Each word was a cut deeper than the last. Richard defended her fiercely whenever he was present, but he couldn't be everywhere. Couldn't stop the looks or the sudden silences when she approached a group of women. By summer, Thea had withdrawn almost completely from town life. She tended their small garden with obsessive care, as though nurturing plants might somehow fill the void inside her. Richard worked longer hours on their ranch, expanding operations, taking on more cattle than they'd previously managed. They moved around each other carefully, their conversations pleasant but increasingly shallow, avoiding the growing emptiness between them. It wasn't until the scorching August afternoon when Richard found Thea sitting alone by the creek that runs through their property that something finally broke through their careful facade. "You weren't at the house," he said, lowering himself beside her on the grassy bank. "I was worried." Thea trailed her fingers through the cool water. "I needed to think." "About what?" She looked at him then, really looked at him for what felt like the first time in months. The sun had deepened the lines around his eyes, and there was a new weariness in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. "About letting you go," she said simply. Richard stared at her as though she'd struck him. "What are you talking about? You deserve children, Richard, a family. The chance to see your name continue." The words had been rehearsed in her mind so many times they came out with a flat calm that belied the agony behind them. "There are plenty of women in town who would make you a good wife, women who could give you sons." The color drained from Richard's face. "Is that what you think I want? That I married you just to breed?" "No, but no buts," he cut her off, his voice sharper than she'd ever heard it. "I married you because I love you, Theodora Nelson, not for what your body could or couldn't do." "But you're unhappy," she whispered. "I'm unhappy because my wife is slipping away from me," Richard countered. "Not because we don't have children." Thea shook her head, unconvinced. "I see how you look at the children in town. I know you wanted a family, wanted, yes, but not at the cost of you." Richard took her hands, forcing her to look at him. "If having children means losing you, then I choose you. Every time." For the first time in months, Thea felt something other than despair, but it was a fragile hope, easily crushed by the reality of their situation. "The town will never let us forget. Your parents will never accept. Then we'll leave," Richard said with sudden resolution. "Leave. But this land has been in your family for it's just land, Thea. We can find new land. A new start somewhere people don't know us or our business." His eyes were bright with determination. "What do you say? Just you and me?" The idea was so sudden, so contrary to everything she knew about Richard's attachment to his family's legacy that Thea could only stare at him in wonder. "You would do that, leave everything behind, for you?" In a heartbeat. That night, as they lay in bed discussing the possibility of selling their ranch and moving west, perhaps to one of the new territories opening up, a pounding at their door interrupted their first truly hopeful conversation in months. Richard grabbed his rifle. Nighttime visitors in the remote areas around Rico were rarely bearers of good news and went to answer. Thea pulled on her robe and followed, staying back in the shadow of the hallway. The door swung open to reveal a young man, barely more than a boy, his face streaked with dirt and what looked like blood. "Mr. Nelson," he panted, "there's been an accident at the Whitaker place. Their barn caught fire from a lightning strike. They're trying to save the livestock, but they need help." Richard didn't hesitate. "I'll saddle up." "Thea," he called over his shoulder, "can you put together some bandages and salve? The Whitaker children might need tending." Within minutes, they were riding hard toward the orange glow visible on the horizon. Thea had packed her mother's old medical kit, herbs and tinctures and clean cloths that might be useful. Her mother had been known as something of a healer before consumption took her when Thea was 16. It was one of the skills Thea had inherited, though she rarely had cause to use it beyond treating Richard's occasional work injuries. The scene at the Whitaker farm was chaos. The barn was fully engulfed, men forming a bucket line from the well to the edges of the structure, trying to keep the fire from spreading to the house. Livestock bellowed in panic from a hastily constructed pen at a safe distance. Mrs. Whitaker sat on the ground, clutching her youngest child while the older two huddled beside her, faces smudged with soot and tears. Richard immediately joined the men while Thea hurried to Mrs. Whitaker. "Are you all hurt?" she asked, kneeling beside the family. Martha Whitaker looked up with red-rimmed eyes. Joseph's hands are burned. He was trying to get the horses out. Thea turned her attention to the 12-year-old boy who held his hands palms up, revealing angry red blisters. "Let me help with that," she said softly, opening her kit. As she worked, applying a cooling salve to Joseph's burns and bandaging them carefully, shouts from the burning barn caught her attention. "There's someone still inside." Thea's head snapped up to see Richard and two other men at the barn entrance, which was now partially collapsed and belching black smoke. "Grayson's in there," someone shouted. "He went back for the new foal." Before anyone could stop him, Richard had ducked under a falling beam and disappeared into the inferno. Thea's heart stopped, her hands freezing in the middle of tying Joseph's bandage. "Richard," she screamed, rising to her feet. Long, agonizing minutes passed. The roof of the barn began to collapse in sections, sending showers of sparks into the night sky. Just when Thea was certain she had lost him, Richard emerged from the smoke, half carrying, half dragging a man whose clothes were smoldering. Behind them, miraculously, stumbled a gangly foal, its eyes wide with terror. The crowd rushed forward to help. Richard and the rescued man, whom Thea now recognized as Grayson Harper, a drifter who'd been working for the Whitakers, collapsed onto the ground several yards from the barn. Both were coughing violently, their faces blackened by smoke. Thea ran to her husband, heart pounding with fear and relief. "Richard, are you hurt?" He couldn't speak through his coughing but shook his head, pointing instead to Grayson, who was clutching his leg. The fabric of his trousers was burned away, revealing a nasty burn that ran from knee to ankle. For the next hour, Thea worked alongside the other women to tend the injured while the men continued fighting the fire. By dawn, the barn was nothing but smoldering ruins, but the house and most of the livestock had been saved. The human toll was limited to burns and smoke inhalation, with no lives lost. A miracle, everyone agreed. As the sun rose, Richard and Thea prepared to return home. They were exhausted, filthy with soot, but there was something different in the way the townspeople looked at them, at Thea specifically. She had worked through the night, calm and capable, treating burns, checking for smoke damage to lungs, comforting frightened children. "You have your mother's gift," Martha Whitaker said as she pressed a basket of fresh eggs into Thea's hands. "I don't know what we would have done without your help tonight." Others murmured agreement, and for the first time in months, Thea felt the warmth of belonging rather than the cold sting of judgment. On the ride home, Richard reached over from his horse to take her hand. "You were amazing tonight." Thea smiled tiredly. It felt good to be useful. "You've always been more than useful, Thea. You're essential." He squeezed her hand. "But I saw something tonight, the way you were with those children. There's more than one way to mother." The words settled into Thea's heart, a seed taking tentative root, more than one way to mother. She had never considered that her nurturing nature could find expression beyond having children of her own. That night, as they fell into exhausted sleep, Thea dreamed not of the children she couldn't have, but of possibilities she hadn't yet imagined. The idea came to her 3 days later, as she was collecting eggs from their small henhouse. Richard was already out checking on a heifer that was close to calving, having recovered quickly from the smoke he'd inhaled during the fire. Thea had just placed the last egg in her basket when she heard the sound of an approaching wagon. Visitors were rare enough that she hurried to the front of the house, shading her eyes against the morning sun to see who was coming. It was Martha Whitaker, driving the family's buckboard with her 3 children beside her. Thea set down her basket and wiped her hands on her apron, curious about this unexpected visit. "Good morning," she called as the wagon drew up to the house. "What brings you out this way?" Martha looked nervous, twisting her hands in her lap. "I hope we're not intruding, but we wanted to ask you something." "Of course not. Come in for some tea," Thea offered, already moving toward the porch. "Actually," Martha said, "what I have to ask might be better discussed here before we commit to staying." Intrigued, Thea waited while Martha helped her children down from the wagon. Joseph's hands were still bandaged, but the younger two, Emma, age 8, and William, just 5, looked healthy if somewhat subdued. "The thing is," Martha began, her voice unsteady, "my sister in Denver has written to say that my mother is very ill. Consumption, the doctor thinks. She's asking for me to come." "Oh, Martha, I'm so sorry," Thea said, genuine concern in her voice. "Thank you. But here's my difficulty. With the barn gone and Howard working from dawn till dusk to rebuild before winter, I can't take the children with me to Denver. It's no place for them, especially with consumption in the house." Martha's eyes filled with tears. "I thought perhaps, since you were so good with them during the fire and they already know you from church and town, maybe you might consider keeping them for a few weeks while I go to my mother." Thea stared at Martha in astonishment. "You want me to look after your children?" "I know it's a lot to ask," Martha rushed on, "and I understand if you can't, but they're good children and they can help around your place. Joseph's handy with the animals when his hands heal, and Emma's a fair little cook already." The 3 Whitaker children looked up at Thea with varying expressions of hope and apprehension. Little William clutched a worn stuffed bear, his lower lip trembling slightly. Thea found herself at a loss for words. This woman who had always been politely distant, who Thea suspected had been among those whispering about her barrenness, was now entrusting her with her most precious possessions. "I would need to speak with Richard, of course." "Of course," Martha nodded. "We can come back tomorrow if—" "No need for that," came Richard's voice as he rounded the corner of the house. He'd clearly heard enough of the conversation to understand the situation. "The children are welcome to stay with us for as long as you need, Martha." Thea shot him a look of surprise, but Richard's expression was resolute. He moved to stand beside her, his hand finding hers and squeezing gently in reassurance. "Are you certain?" Martha asked, looking between them. "It's no small thing I'm asking." "We're certain," Richard confirmed, and Thea found herself nodding in agreement, a strange excitement building in her chest. After discussing the details, how long Martha expected to be gone, what the children would need, arrangements for getting word to Rico if necessary, it was decided that the Whitaker children would move into the Nelson homestead the following day. That night, as Thea and Richard prepared their small home for 3 additional occupants, she finally asked the question that had been on her mind all day. "Why did you agree so quickly, without even discussing it with me first?" Richard paused in his work of moving a small dresser into what had been their unused second bedroom. "I saw your face when Martha asked. You wanted to say yes immediately." "I did," Thea admitted, smoothing fresh linens over the bed they were preparing, "but it's a big change for us." 3 children, Richard, in our quiet home." Richard smiled, crossing the room to take her hands. "Our too quiet home. Thea, do you remember what I said after the fire, about there being more than one way to mother?" She nodded. "I meant it. You have so much love to give. Maybe this is where it's meant to go, not just to our own children, but to any child who needs it." He touched her cheek gently. "And selfishly, I'm curious to see what you're like surrounded by children. I have a feeling it will be quite a sight." Thea leaned into his touch, tears threatening. "What if I'm not good at it? What if they hate me?" "Impossible," Richard said firmly. "Anyone who doesn't love you simply hasn't spent enough time with you yet." The next morning dawned bright and clear, a perfect late summer day. Thea rose early, baking bread and preparing the house with an energy she hadn't felt in months. Richard, seeing her enthusiasm, smiled to himself as he completed his morning chores. By midday, Martha arrived with the children and their belongings, a trunk of clothes, a few books and toys, and Joseph's prized fishing rod. The goodbyes were tearful, particularly from little William, but Martha promised to return as quickly as she could. "You're doing a kindness I can never repay," she told Thea as she prepared to leave. "I'll pray for you every day." As Martha's wagon disappeared down the road, Thea found herself standing on the porch with 3 pairs of eyes looking up at her expectantly. For a moment, panic seized her. What did she know about caring for children? Then Richard appeared beside her, steady and confident. "Well now," he said cheerfully to the children, "who's hungry?" The simple question broke the tension, and soon they were all seated around the table that had seemed too large for just two people, but was now perfectly filled. As Thea served bread still warm from the oven, she caught Richard watching her with a soft expression that made her heart swell. The first few days were a whirlwind of adjustment. The Nelson home, once orderly and quiet, became a place of constant motion and sound. William had nightmares the first 2 nights, calling for his mother in the dark. Thea would go to him, stroke his hair, and tell him stories until he drifted back to sleep. Joseph tested boundaries, as boys his age were wont to do, but Richard's firm yet kind guidance quickly earned his respect. Emma, serious and helpful, attached herself to Thea, following her through daily chores and asking endless questions. By the end of the first week, they had fallen into a rhythm. Mornings began with breakfast and chores. Afternoons with lessons. Thea had been a schoolteacher briefly before her marriage or adventures around the property. Evenings were for stories by the fire and prayers before bed. It was during one of these evening story times, as Thea read from a worn copy of Robinson Crusoe, with William curled against her side and Emma leaning on her shoulder, that she caught Richard watching them from his chair. The look in his eyes, pride, love, and something like wonder nearly took her breath away. Later, when the children were asleep, he pulled her into his arms in the privacy of their bedroom. "You were born for this," he murmured against her hair. "To nurture, to teach, to love. It doesn't matter that they didn't come from your body." Thea closed her eyes, letting his words wash over her. For the first time since the doctor's devastating news, she felt whole, complete. "I love having them here," she confessed. "I'm going to miss them terribly when Martha returns." Richard was quiet for a moment. "Maybe," he said slowly, "this doesn't have to end when Martha comes back." "What do you mean?" "There are children who need homes, Thea. Orphans from the war, from disease, from accidents in the mines. We could open our home to them." The idea settled into Thea's heart like a missing piece clicking into place. "Do you mean it? You would want that?" "I want whatever makes that light come back into your eyes," Richard said, touching her face gently. "And yes, I want children in our home, however they come to us." The next morning, a letter arrived from Martha. Her mother's condition had worsened rapidly, and she expected to be in Denver longer than anticipated, perhaps as much as 2 months. She wrote of her worry for the children and her gratitude for the Nelsons' care. Thea read the letter aloud to Richard over breakfast after the children had gone outside to feed the chickens. 2 months, she said. "That's much longer than we expected. Are you concerned?" Richard asked, watching her carefully. "No," she replied, surprising herself with how firmly she meant it. "No, I'm glad. It gives us more time with them, and—" She hesitated, then pressed on. "It gives us time to consider your suggestion about taking in other children who need homes." Richard's face lit up. "You're truly interested in the idea?" "I am." Thea reached across the table for his hand. "These past days with the Whitaker children have shown me that there's a different kind of joy in caring for children who aren't your own by birth. A different kind of bond, but no less real." Before Richard could respond, the door burst open and Joseph ran in, excitement written across his face. "Mr. Nelson, there's a man coming up the road on horseback. Looks like he's hurt." Richard was on his feet immediately, grabbing his hat. "Stay here with the little ones," he told Thea, following Joseph outside. From the window, Thea could see a rider slumped over his horse's neck, barely staying in the saddle. The horse, seemingly sensing safety, had turned up their drive of its own accord. As she watched, Richard ran to intercept the animal, catching its bridle just as the rider began to slip from the saddle. With Joseph's help, Richard eased the man to the ground. Even from a distance, Thea could see the dark stain of blood on the stranger's side. She hurried to the door, calling for Emma to watch William inside. By the time she reached them, Richard and Joseph had moved the injured man to the shade of a large oak. He was young, perhaps in his late 20s, with the lean, weather-beaten look of someone who lived hard in the outdoors. His face was pale beneath his tan, and his breathing came in short, painful gasps. "Bullet wound," Richard said grimly as Thea knelt beside them. "Looks like it went clean through his side, but he's lost a lot of blood." "We need to get him inside," Thea said, already assessing what she would need to treat such an injury. "Joseph, can you help your uncle bring him?" Between them, Richard and Joseph managed to carry the unconscious man into the house and onto the small bed in Richard's office. Emma had already set water to boil, sensing it would be needed, and was keeping William occupied in the kitchen. As Thea gathered her mother's medical supplies, Richard carefully removed the stranger's bloodied shirt. The wound was ugly, but as Richard had suspected, the bullet had passed through the fleshy part of the man's side without hitting any vital organs. "He's lucky," Thea murmured, cleaning the wound with steady hands. "An inch to the right and it would have hit his liver. Do you think he'll make it?" Joseph asked, his young face serious as he helped by handing Thea clean cloths. "With proper care, yes," she answered. "He's young and strong, but he'll need time to heal." As she worked, stitching the entry and exit wounds with the neat, tiny stitches her mother had taught her, the stranger began to stir. His eyes flew open, startlingly blue against his tanned skin, and he tried to sit up, panic evident in his expression. "Easy," Richard said, placing a firm hand on the man's shoulder. "You're safe here. We're tending your wounds." The man's eyes darted around the room, taking in Richard, Thea, and Joseph. Slowly, the panic receded from his face, replaced by a grimace of pain. "Where?" "You're at the Nelson Ranch, about 5 miles outside of Rico," Richard informed him. "Your horse brought you to us. Mind telling us who you are and how you came to be shot?" The man licked his dry lips. "Name's Grayson Morgan. I was ambushed. 2 men. Wanted my horse and whatever I had in my saddlebags." "Road agents," Richard said with a frown. "They've been getting bolder lately. Did you get a look at them?" Grayson shook his head weakly. "Wore bandanas over their faces. One had a scar through his eyebrow." Richard and Thea exchanged a glance. The description matched a notorious outlaw who had been terrorizing travelers in the area for months. "You're lucky to be alive," Thea said, finishing her stitching and beginning to bandage the wound. "Most who encounter Scarface Brady don't live to tell about it." "Wasn't luck," Grayson said, his voice growing stronger. "I got one of them, shot him in the leg before they rode off." A shadow crossed his face. "They still got my money, though, everything I had." "Well, you're welcome to stay here until you're healed up," Richard offered. "We've got a full house at the moment, but we can make room." Grayson looked at Joseph questioningly. "The children are staying with us temporarily," Thea explained. "Their mother had to travel to Denver for a family emergency." "I couldn't impose," Grayson began, but was interrupted by a wave of pain that left him white-faced and gasping. "You don't have much choice," Thea said firmly. "You've lost too much blood to go anywhere for at least a few days. After that, we'll see." Too weak to argue, Grayson nodded and closed his eyes, drifting back into unconsciousness. For the next several days, Thea divided her attention between caring for the Whitaker children and tending to their unexpected guest. Grayson proved to be a surprisingly good patient, accepting her care with quiet gratitude. He developed a fever on the second night, and Thea sat up with him, bathing his forehead with cool water and administering her mother's herbal teas when he was lucid enough to swallow. By the 3rd day, the fever broke, and Grayson began to regain his strength. He was able to sit up and take meals with the family, though he tired quickly and spent much of his time resting. The children, initially wary of the stranger, soon warmed to him. Joseph, in particular, was fascinated by Grayson's tales of his travels throughout the West. Emma appreciated his quiet help with her reading lessons when Thea was busy, and even little William would sometimes sit beside Grayson's bed, showing him his treasured toy soldiers. "You have a way with children," Thea remarked one afternoon as she changed Grayson's bandages. The children were outside with Richard, helping to mend a section of fence. Grayson smiled, a warm expression that transformed his weathered face. "I had a lot of younger siblings growing up, 6 of them." 6, Thea's eyes widened. Your poor mother, she loved it actually, always said a house wasn't a home without children's laughter. A shadow crossed his face. They're all back east now, I haven't seen them in years. Why not? Thea asked, then immediately regretted the question. I'm sorry, that's too personal. No, it's all right. Grayson shifted slightly, wincing at the pull on his stitches. My father and I had a falling out. He wanted me to take over the family business. He's a banker in Boston, but I couldn't stomach the idea of spending my life behind a desk. We said things. Well, things that are hard to take back, so I came west. And became what, a drifter? There was no judgment in Thea's voice, only curiosity. I prefer adventurer, Grayson said with a hint of humor. But yes, I've moved around. Tried my hand at prospecting, drove cattle, worked as a scout for a while, never stayed in one place too long. Sounds lonely, Thea observed, securing the fresh bandage. Grayson was quiet for a moment. It can be, he finally admitted, but there's a freedom to it too. No expectations except the ones I put on myself. He looked at her thoughtfully. What about you? How did you end up in Rico? I was born not far from here, Thea explained. My father was a miner who struck a modest silver vein enough to build a comfortable life, but not enough to get rich. He died in a cave-in when I was 14. My mother and I managed on our own until she took sick with consumption when I was 16. She busied herself with putting away her medical supplies. I taught school for a while after she passed. That's how I met Richard. His youngest sister was one of my students. And now you have a house full of children anyway, Grayson observed with a smile. Funny how life works out. Thea stilled her back to him. They're not mine, she said softly. Not really. Blood doesn't make a family, Grayson said with surprising gentleness. Love does. Anyone can see how much those children adore you. Thea turned to look at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Thank you for saying that. Over the next 2 weeks, Grayson's strength returned steadily. Soon, he was able to join the family for meals at the table, and even help with light chores around the house. His presence became a natural part of their daily routine, his deep voice reading stories to the children in the evening, his skilled hands helping Emma learn to whittle simple figures from soft pine, his patient instruction as Joseph practiced his letters. Richard observed the growing camaraderie between his wife and their guest with a mixture of gratitude and thoughtfulness. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset while the children played in the yard with Grayson, he brought up the subject that had been on his mind. He's good with them, Richard noted, nodding toward where Grayson was demonstrating how to skip stones across the small pond near the house. He is, Thea agreed, her face soft with contentment. It's been nice having another adult around. Especially a man who can connect with Joseph the way Grayson does. I've been thinking, Richard said slowly, about what we discussed, taking in children who need homes. Thea turned to him, her attention fully engaged, and I think it's right for us. More than right, it feels necessary somehow. Richard reached for her hand. Seeing you these past weeks, with the Whitaker children and even with Grayson when he was at his weakest. Thea, you were meant to nurture, it's who you are. Tears welled in Thea's eyes. Do you really think we could do it? Open our home to orphan children? I do, but we'd need help. Richard's gaze drifted back to Grayson. I was thinking we might offer Grayson a more permanent position here. We could use an extra hand, especially if we're going to have more children around. Do you think he'd stay? Thea asked, surprised by how much she hoped the answer was yes. He seems like the type who moves on. Sometimes a man just needs a reason to put down roots, Richard said thoughtfully. Maybe we can give him one. Later that evening, after the children were asleep, they approached Grayson with their proposition. He listened in silence as Richard outlined their vision, expanding the ranch, building additional rooms onto the house, creating a place where children without families could find a home. We'd need help, Richard concluded. Someone good with animals and land, someone the children already trust. The pay wouldn't be much at first, but you'd have a home here, for as long as you wanted it. Grayson sat very still, his eyes moving from Richard to Thea and back again. Why me? He finally asked, "You barely know me." "We know enough," Thea said gently. "We've seen how you are with the children, how quick you are to help, even when you're still healing, how respectful you've been of our home and our ways." "I'm a drifter," Grayson pointed out. "I don't stay in one place." "Maybe it's time to try," Richard suggested. "You said yourself that the wandering life gets lonely." Grayson looked down at his hands, calloused and strong but oddly restless in his lap. "I don't know if I remember how to belong somewhere," he admitted quietly. "You can learn," Thea assured him. "If you want to. Think about it," Richard offered. "No need to decide tonight. You're welcome to stay until you're fully healed regardless." That night, as Thea and Richard prepared for bed, she couldn't help wondering if they had overstepped. What if he feels pressured to accept? "He's still dependent on our care, after all. Grayson Morgan doesn't strike me as a man who can be pressured into anything he doesn't want to do," Richard said with a smile. "He'll make his choice freely." The next morning, Thea rose early to start breakfast, only to find Grayson already in the kitchen. He had managed to dress himself completely for the first time since his injury, though he moved carefully to avoid pulling at his healing wound. "I couldn't sleep," he explained when he saw her surprise. "Thought I might as well make myself useful." Thea smiled, moving to help him with the coffee he was attempting to prepare. "Thinking about our offer?" "Yes," Grayson handed her the coffee tin. "It's generous, more than generous." "But—" Thea prompted, hearing the hesitation in his voice. Grayson leaned against the counter, his expression serious. "I've never stayed anywhere long enough to be part of something. I'm not sure I know how." "None of us know how to do something until we try," Thea pointed out gently. "When the Whitakers first asked me to care for their children, I was terrified. I'd never been responsible for children before, but it turns out love and patience go a long way." "You make it sound simple." "Not simple," Thea corrected, "but worthwhile." She busied herself with measuring coffee grounds. "Richard and I have been talking about this plan for weeks now, ever since the Whitaker children came to stay. But it was just talk until you arrived. Somehow, you being here made it feel possible." Grayson studied her, his blue eyes intent. "You really believe in this, don't you? Creating a home for children who have none?" "I do," Thea said softly. "More than anything." Something shifted in Grayson's expression, a decision forming. "Then I'll stay," he said simply. "At least until you get established, see if it works out." Thea's face lit up with genuine joy. "Really? You'll stay?" "I'll stay," Grayson confirmed, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Though God knows I'm not much of a farmer." "You'll learn," Thea said confidently, "if you want to." The weeks that followed were filled with plans and preparations. Richard and Grayson began work on an addition to the house, 2 new bedrooms, and an expanded kitchen. Thea wrote letters to contacts in Denver about the possibility of taking in orphan children and received encouraging responses. The Whitaker children, delighted to learn they might have permanent playmates in the future, threw themselves into helping with the preparations. September gave way to October, bringing crisp mornings and golden afternoons. The addition to the house took shape quickly, with both men working long hours. Grayson's wound healed completely, leaving only a puckered scar as a reminder of his close call. He proved to be a quick study with the ranch work, his natural affinity with animals making up for his lack of farming experience. As the days passed, Thea noticed a change in him. The restlessness that had marked his manner began to fade, replaced by a steady purpose. He rose each morning with the sun, worked alongside Richard with growing confidence, and spent his evenings engaged with the children, teaching Joseph to play chess, helping Emma with her reading, building elaborate block structures with William. It was during one of these evening activities, as Grayson sat on the floor patiently showing William how to tie a proper knot, that a knock came at the door. Richard opened it to find Martha Whitaker standing on the porch, her face tired but relieved. "Martha?" Thea exclaimed, rushing forward. "We weren't expecting you for another week at least." "My mother passed 3 days ago," Martha explained, accepting Thea's embrace with a grateful sigh. "Peacefully, thank God. There was nothing keeping me in Denver after that. The reunion between Martha and her children was joyful and tearful. William clung to his mother as though he might never let go, while Emma and Joseph competed to tell her everything she had missed during her absence. Through it all, Thea felt a bittersweet ache in her heart, joy for the family reunited, sadness for the emptiness their departure would leave. Martha stayed for dinner, during which she studied the changed dynamics of the Nelson household with interest. "You've added to your family while I was away," she observed, nodding toward Grayson. "Temporarily," Grayson clarified, though his eyes flickered to Thea with an unreadable expression. "Grayson is helping us expand the house," Richard explained. "We're planning to take in orphan children, provide them with a home and family." Martha's eyes widened. That's a remarkable undertaking." "We've learned a lot from having your children here," Thea said warmly. "They've brought such joy to our home." "They're certainly fond of you," Martha noted, watching as Emma helped Thea serve dessert with practiced coordination. "I've never seen Joseph so attentive to his schoolwork, and William hasn't mentioned his nightmares once." "They've been a blessing to us," Richard said sincerely. Later, as Martha prepared to take her children back to their own home now repaired and ready for habitation, she pulled Thea aside. "I don't know how to thank you properly," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've done more than care for my children. You've given them something they needed, something I wasn't sure how to provide after Howard died." Thea squeezed Martha's hands. "They're wonderful children. It was our privilege to have them here. Would you consider—" Martha hesitated. "Would you consider letting them visit regularly? They've thrived under your care and with me alone at the farm." "Of course," Thea agreed immediately. "Anytime, and perhaps when we've established our home for orphans, you might help. We'll need women from the community who understand what we're trying to do." Martha's face brightened. "I'd be honored, truly." The goodbyes were difficult, especially for William, who clung to Thea's skirts until the last possible moment. "You'll come visit tomorrow," she promised him, kneeling to meet his eyes. "And the day after that, if you like. This will always be a place where you're welcome." As the Whittaker wagon disappeared down the drive, Thea felt Richard's arm slip around her waist. "They'll be back," he murmured against her hair. "I know," she sighed. "But the house will seem so empty tonight." "Not for long," Richard reminded her. "If all goes well with the letters you've sent, we could have our first permanent children by Christmas." From behind them came the sound of Grayson clearing his throat. They turned to find him standing awkwardly in the doorway, hat in hand. "I was thinking," he said, "that with the children gone, you might not need me here anymore. I could find lodging in town, come out during the days to work on the addition." "Nonsense," Richard said firmly. "Your place is here, unless you've changed your mind about staying." Grayson shook his head. "No, I want to stay. I just thought, well, it's your home, your family." "And you're part of it now," Thea said simply. "If you want to be." The sincerity in her voice seemed to catch Grayson off guard. He looked between them, these people who had taken him in as a wounded stranger and now offered him a place in their lives. "I want to be," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. That night, as promised, the house seemed too quiet without the children's chatter. Thea found herself moving restlessly from room to room, straightening things that didn't need straightening, unable to settle. She was in the kitchen, needlessly reorganizing a cabinet when Grayson appeared in the doorway. "Can't sleep?" he asked softly. Thea shook her head. "It's too quiet. I got used to checking on the children before bed, listening for William's nightmares." Grayson nodded in understanding. "They leave a big space behind." "They do." Thea closed the cabinet, turning to face him. "Do you ever think about the family you left behind, your siblings?" "Every day," Grayson admitted, moving into the kitchen and leaning against the table. "Especially my youngest sister, Clara. She was only 8 when I left. She probably doesn't even remember me clearly now." "Have you written to them?" Thea asked gently. "No." Grayson's expression clouded. "My father made it clear that if I left, I shouldn't expect to be welcomed back, said he'd consider me dead to the family." "But you're not writing to your father, you'd be writing to your siblings." Grayson considered this, his brow furrowed. I suppose that's true, but after so many years. It's never too late to rebuild a connection, Thea said, thinking of her own isolation after learning of her barrenness, how she had pulled away from the community until circumstances forced her back into engagement. People can surprise you with their capacity for forgiveness and understanding. Maybe you're right, Grayson straightened, something like resolve settling over his features. Maybe it's time to stop running from the past. If you decide to write, Thea offered, I'd be happy to help. I have decent penmanship, if I do say so myself. Grayson's smile was warm and genuine. I'd appreciate that. Thank you, Thea, for everything. As November settled over Rico with its shorter days and frost-covered mornings, life at the Nelson Ranch fell into a new rhythm. The addition to the house was completed just before the first serious snowfall, and Thea set about furnishing the new rooms with beds, dressers, and cheerful curtains. The Whitaker children visited often, sometimes staying overnight when Martha needed to travel to town for supplies. Word had spread through the community about the Nelsons' plans to provide a home for orphaned children. To Thea's surprise, the reaction was overwhelmingly positive. Women from town began arriving with donations: quilts, children's clothing, books, toys. Men offered lumber for additional furniture, tools for the expanded garden Thea planned to plant in spring. Even Richard's parents, who had been distant since learning of Thea's inability to bear children, came for a visit. Catherine Nelson, a stern woman who rarely displayed emotion, walked through the expanded house with careful attention to every detail. "It's a good thing you're doing," she said finally, as Thea showed her the new bedroom that would soon house up to 4 children. "Taking in those who have no one else." "Thank you," Thea said, touched by the unexpected approval. "We hope to make a real difference." Catherine hesitated, then reached out to take Thea's hand, an unprecedented gesture from her mother-in-law. "I owe you an apology, Theodora. When we learned you couldn't have children, I allowed my disappointment about the Nelson name to overshadow what was truly important." Thea stood very still, hardly daring to breathe lest this moment of connection break. "Richard is happy," Catherine continued. "Happier than I've seen him in a long time. And these children you'll take in, they'll carry the Nelson values, if not the Nelson blood. That's what truly matters." Her grip on Thea's hand tightened. "Family is more than bloodlines, I see that now." Tears pricked at Thea's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "That means more than you know." December arrived with a letter from Denver that set the household into a flurry of activity. An orphanage had 2 siblings, a boy of 10, and a girl of 7 whose prospects for adoption were poor due to the boy's badly healed broken leg, which left him with a permanent limp. Would the Nelsons consider taking them? "Of course we'll take them," Thea said immediately, her heart already reaching out to these unknown children who had been deemed less desirable because of a physical impairment. "It says they can bring them by train as far as Durango," Richard read from the letter. "We'd need to collect them there." "I'll go," Grayson offered. "The weather's holding, and I know that route well. I could have them back here within 3 days." And so it was decided. Grayson would travel to Durango to meet the children Daniel and Sarah Miller and bring them to their new home in time for Christmas. The day of Grayson's departure dawned cold and clear. Thea rose early to prepare provisions for his journey, packing bread, dried meat, and apples into his saddlebags. "There's enough here to feed an army," Grayson protested as she added yet another package. "The children might be hungry on the return journey," Thea pointed out. "Better to have too much than too little." Richard appeared in the kitchen doorway carrying a small wooden box. "Almost ready to ride out?" he asked Grayson. "Just about." Grayson gestured to his bulging saddlebags. "If these don't slow my horse to a crawl." Richard smiled, then held out the box. "I want you to take this with you." Grayson accepted it with a puzzled expression. Opening it, he found a gleaming revolver nestled in soft cloth. "Richard, I can't accept this. This is your father's Colt." "And now it's yours," Richard said firmly. "The roads aren't always safe, and you'll have children with you on the return journey. I want you properly armed." The significance of the gift wasn't lost on any of them. Richard's father's revolver was a family heirloom passed down at significant moments. By giving it to Grayson, Richard was making a statement about where Grayson stood in their lives. "I'll treasure it," Grayson said, his voice rough with emotion, "and use it only if absolutely necessary." "That's all I ask." Richard clapped him on the shoulder. "Now get going, those children are waiting for you." Thea walked with Grayson to where his horse was saddled and waiting. "Be careful," she said, adjusting his scarf against the cold. "And tell Daniel and Sarah. Tell them we're excited to meet them, that we have a home ready and waiting." "I will." Grayson hesitated, then reached into his pocket. "I have something for you too, a thank you for everything you and Richard have done for me." He pressed a small package into her hands. Thea unwrapped it to find a delicately carved wooden pendant on a leather cord. The carving was of a tree with spreading branches, each one detailed with tiny leaves. "Grayson, it's beautiful," she breathed, running her finger over the intricate work. "I've been working on it in the evenings," he explained. "The tree of life, it seemed, appropriate for what you're building here." Thea looked up at him, deeply touched. "Thank you, I'll wear it always." Grayson mounted his horse, settling himself in the saddle. "I'll be back with the children in 3 days. 4 at the most if the weather turns." "We'll be waiting," Thea promised. After Grayson's departure, Thea threw herself into final preparations for the children's arrival. The new bedrooms were furnished simply but comfortably, with handmade quilts from town ladies brightening the beds. Richard constructed a small desk for Daniel, knowing from the orphanage's letter that the boy enjoyed drawing. Thea found a doll at the general store for Sarah, along with ribbons for her hair. "You think they'll like it here?" she asked Richard anxiously as they stood in the children's bedroom the night before Grayson was expected to return with them. "It's so different from Denver." "They'll love it," Richard assured her, wrapping an arm around her waist. "How could they not? They're coming to a home where they're wanted, where no one will see Daniel's limp as a reason to pass him over." The next day dawned with heavy clouds that soon began dropping snow lightly at first, then with increasing determination. By midday, Thea was watching the road anxiously, though she knew it was too early to expect Grayson and the children. "They might be delayed by the snow," Richard cautioned as evening approached with no sign of travelers. "Grayson won't risk the children's safety by pushing through bad weather." "I know," Thea sighed, still unable to tear herself away from the window. "I just can't help worrying." By the second day of snowfall, with still no word from Grayson, concern began to deepen into genuine worry. The snow had piled up significantly, making travel difficult if not dangerous. "Should we send someone to look for them?" Thea asked as she and Richard sat at breakfast. "What if they're stranded somewhere?" "Grayson knows these mountains," Richard reminded her, though his own brow was furrowed with concern. "He wouldn't take chances with the children. If the weather was too bad, he'd find shelter and wait it out." By midday, however, Richard's concern had grown enough that he began preparations to ride out in search of the missing party. He was in the barn, saddling his horse, when the sound of approaching hooves made him pause. "Thea," he called, rushing to the barn door. "Someone's coming." Thea appeared on the porch, shading her eyes against the snow glare. At first, all she could make out was a single horse pulling what appeared to be a small sleigh, not Grayson on horseback with 2 children as expected. But as the conveyance drew closer, she recognized Grayson handling the reins, with 2 small, bundled figures beside him. "It's them," she cried, gathering her skirts and hurrying through the snow toward the approaching sleigh. Grayson's face, red with cold, broke into a relieved smile as he saw them. "Sorry for the delay," he called. "Had to trade my horse for this rig when the snow got too deep for riding with the children." The sleigh came to a stop, and Thea got her first clear look at Daniel and Sarah Miller. They were bundled in what appeared to be every blanket Grayson could find, their small faces peering out from wool scarves. The boy, Daniel, had serious eyes that assessed Thea and Richard carefully. Beside him, little Sarah clutched a worn rag doll, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and trepidation. "Daniel, Sarah," Grayson said, his voice gentle, "this is Mr. and Mrs. Nelson. They've been waiting very eagerly to meet you." Thea stepped forward, her heart in her throat. "Welcome," she said softly. "We're so glad you're here safely." For a moment, no one moved. Then Sarah, apparently making a decision, struggled free of her blankets and held out her arms to Thea. Without hesitation, Thea lifted the child from the sleigh, holding her close. "Are you really going to be our new mama?" Sarah asked, her voice small but clear, Thea's eyes filled with tears. "If you'd like me to be," she managed, "and is this big house all for us?" Daniel asked, his eyes still cautious but a hint of wonder creeping into his voice as he took in the expanded homestead. "It is," Richard confirmed, moving to help the boy down from the sleigh. He did so carefully, mindful of Daniel's leg. "Your bedroom is all ready. Would you like to see it?" Daniel nodded, some of his reserve melting at Richard's matter-of-fact treatment of him, no pity or awkwardness about his disability, just a straightforward welcome. As they moved toward the house, Grayson hanging back slightly to give the family this moment, Thea felt something settle in her heart. These children might not have come from her body, but they were hers all the same. Hers to love, to protect, to nurture. That evening, after Daniel and Sarah had been fed, bathed, and tucked into their new beds, Thea found herself on the porch despite the cold. The snow had stopped and the night was clear, stars pricking the black sky with impossible brightness. The door opened behind her and Grayson stepped out, offering her a steaming cup. "Thought you might need this," he said. "It's getting cold out here." Thea accepted the cup gratefully. "Thank you for everything, for bringing them home safely." "They're good kids," Grayson said, leaning against the porch railing. "Daniel's protective of his sister. Doesn't trust easily, but once he does, I think his loyalty will be absolute. Sarah's a little chatterbox once she warms up." Told me her entire life story between Durango and here. Thea smiled, picturing it. They've been through so much, their parents dying in that fire, then the orphanage. But they're home now, Grayson said simply, where they belong. The certainty in his voice warmed Thea more than the hot drink in her hands. "Yes," she agreed, "they are." Inside the house, Richard was checking on the children one last time before bed. Daniel had fallen asleep almost immediately, exhausted from the journey, but Sarah was still awake, her eyes following Richard as he adjusted her quilt. "Mr. Nelson?" she asked in a small voice. "Yes, Sarah. Will we stay here forever, really forever?" Richard sat carefully on the edge of her bed. "Really forever," he promised. "This is your home now." Sarah considered this, her small brow furrowed in thought. "Even if you and Mrs. Nelson have your own babies someday?" Richard's heart twisted with an unexpected pang. "Mrs. Nelson and I won't be having babies of our own," he said gently. "But you and Daniel are our children now, just as much as if you had been born to us." Sarah's face brightened. "So I don't have to share you," Richard laughed softly, tucking the quilt more securely around her. "You'll have to share us with Daniel, and perhaps someday with other children who need a home like you did, but there will always be plenty of love for you, I promise." Satisfied with this answer, Sarah closed her eyes. "Good night, Papa," she murmured, the title coming naturally to her lips. Richard sat very still, emotion washing over him in an unexpected wave. "Good night, little one," he whispered, bending to kiss her forehead. By Christmas, Daniel and Sarah had settled into life at the Nelson Ranch with remarkable adaptability. Daniel's initial wariness had given way to cautious trust, especially after Richard showed him the workshop and began teaching him basic carpentry skills. Sarah blossomed under Thea's gentle care, following her around the house and helping with simple chores. The Whittaker children visited often, relieving some of the isolation the Miller siblings might otherwise have felt in their new rural home. Joseph and Daniel formed a particular bond, with Joseph showing no concern for Daniel's limp and including him in all activities. Christmas Eve found the expanded Nelson household, gathered around a small pine tree that Richard and Grayson had cut from the far edge of the property. They had decorated it with paper chains made by the children, dried apple slices, and a few precious glass ornaments that had belonged to Thea's mother. "It's the most beautiful tree I've ever seen," Sarah declared, her eyes wide with wonder as Richard lit the single candle at its top. Thea, watching the candlelight reflect in the children's faces, felt her heart might burst with happiness. Richard stood beside her, his arm around her waist while Grayson leaned against the doorway, a small smile playing on his lips. Later, after the children had been tucked in with promises that St. Nicholas would come in the night, the three adults sat by the fire, sharing a pot of coffee and quiet conversation. "I received a letter today," Grayson said suddenly. "From my sister Clara." Thea sat up straighter. "You wrote to your family after our conversation that night when the Whittakers left," Grayson confirmed. "I decided you were right. It was time to stop running from the past." "And your sister responded," Richard noted. "That's promising." "More than promising," Grayson said, his voice colored with emotion. "She says they've been looking for me for years. My father died 2 years ago and his last wish was for them to find me, to tell me he was sorry." "Oh, Grayson," Thea breathed, "how bittersweet." "Clara wants me to visit," Grayson continued. "She and my other siblings have kept my father's business running. They want me to know that I'm welcome, that there's a place for me there if I want it." "Will you go?" Richard asked quietly. Grayson was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire. "I think I should, to make peace with the past if nothing else." He looked up at them. "But not to stay. My home is here now with all of you." The sincerity in his voice brought tears to Thea's eyes. "We'll miss you while you're gone," she said softly. "But family reconciliations are important. You should go with our blessing." "After winter breaks," Grayson agreed. "I wouldn't leave you short-handed with the children and the ranch during the hardest season." As they continued talking, making plans for Grayson's journey east in the spring and for the Nelson home's future expansion to accommodate more children, Thea found herself reflecting on the remarkable journey that had brought them to this point. A year ago, she had been devastated by the doctor's pronouncement, believing her value as a woman and as Richard's wife had been fundamentally diminished. She had been unable to bear the word barren, seeing in it the end of all her dreams. Now she understood that barrenness was merely a physical condition, not a spiritual one. Her capacity to love and nurture had found new channels, flowing out to Daniel and Sarah, to the Whittaker children, even to Grayson in his time of need. Where she had once seen emptiness, she now saw fullness. Where she had seen an ending, she now saw countless beginnings. Christmas morning dawned bright and cold. Thea woke to the sound of excited whispers as Daniel and Sarah discovered their stockings, stuffed with oranges, candy sticks, and small wooden toys that Grayson had carved in secret during the evenings. Richard stirred beside her. "Merry Christmas, my love," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Merry Christmas," she replied, her heart full. "Shall we go see what St. Nicholas brought?" The day unfolded in a tapestry of joy meals shared, gifts exchanged, carols sung around the piano that Richard's parents had surprisingly delivered the week before as their contribution to the children's home. The Whittakers joined them for Christmas dinner, along with several families from town who had supported their endeavor. As evening fell and the visitors departed, Thea found herself standing by the window, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. Richard joined her, slipping an arm around her waist. "What are you thinking about so intently?" he asked. "Everything that's changed this year," she answered honestly. "How close I came to giving up after the doctor told me I was barren, how different our lives would be if I had." Richard turned her gently to face him. "I never gave up on you," he said. "Not for a moment, I know." Thea reached up to touch his face, tracing the beloved lines that had deepened over the years of their marriage. "You said it then, and I don't think I truly understood what you meant." "You're alive, that's all I ever asked." "I meant it," Richard said softly, Everything else, children, the ranch, the future, none of it would matter without you beside me. And now we have all of it anyway, Thea marveled. Children, a growing ranch, a future brighter than I could have imagined. Because you were brave enough to open your heart, Richard said. To see beyond what couldn't be to what could be. From across the room came the sound of children's laughter as Grayson demonstrated a shadow puppet on the wall. Daniel's serious face had relaxed into boyish delight, while Sarah clapped her hands in wonder. Our family, Thea whispered, leaning against her husband's strong shoulder. Not the one we expected, but exactly the one we need. Exactly the one we need, Richard agreed, holding her close as they watched the scene before them, the beginning of a legacy that would extend far beyond bloodlines, touching countless lives in the years to come. In that moment, standing in the warm circle of her husband's arms, surrounded by the family they had created through love rather than birth, Thea finally and completely released the word that had once seemed to define her. Barren. It held no power over her now, no sting, no shadow. In its place stood the truth that Richard had known all along. She was alive, she was loved, and that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. 5 years later, the Nelson family home for children had grown to accommodate 12 children of various ages, backgrounds, and abilities. The original homestead had expanded to include a schoolroom, additional bedrooms, and even a small infirmary where Thea could tend to minor illnesses and injuries. Grayson had returned from his trip east with a newfound peace and a substantial inheritance from his father's estate, much of which he invested in expanding the ranch operations. His siblings had visited twice, bringing gifts for the children and forming bonds that bridged the years of separation. Daniel, now 15, had developed remarkable skill as a carpenter despite his permanent limp. Under Richard's guidance, he had built much of the furniture for the newer parts of the home. Sarah, 12 and blossoming into a beauty, had her mother's gift for nurturing, often being the first to welcome new children to the home. The Whitaker children remained frequent visitors, with Joseph now approaching manhood working summers on the ranch. Emma had become Thea's apprentice in herbal medicine, carefully learning the remedies Thea had inherited from her own mother. On a warm June evening, as Thea stood on the expanded porch watching the children play in the yard, she felt rather than heard Richard approach. His arm slipped around her waist in a gesture that had become so natural it was like breathing. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, his voice still able to send a pleasant shiver through her after all these years. "I was thinking about that day," she replied, "when the doctor told me I was barren. How I thought my life was over." Richard pressed a kiss to her temple. "And look at you now, mother to more children than most women could handle in 3 lifetimes. Thea laughed, leaning into his embrace. "Not just me, look at us. Did you ever imagine we'd be responsible for so many young lives?" "No," Richard admitted, "but I wouldn't change a thing." He nodded toward where Grayson was teaching the newest arrival, a shy 8-year-old boy rescued from an abusive situation in Durango, how to throw a lasso. "I think we've all found our purpose here." Thea fingered the wooden pendant that still hung around her neck, the tree of life that Grayson had carved for her years ago. Its branches now seemed prophetic, each one representing a child who had found shelter under the Nelson roof, each leaf a moment of growth, of healing, of love given and received. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "I haven't heard anyone in town use that word about me in years. Barren." "Because they can see the truth," Richard said simply, "that you're the most fruitful woman I've ever known." As twilight deepened into night and the children were called in for supper, Thea took one last look at the vast Colorado sky, gratitude filling her heart. The word that had once seemed a curse had become the doorway to her greatest blessing, this unconventional, beautiful family that grew not from her body, but from her heart's boundless capacity to love. And as she turned to go inside, where voices and laughter and the warm light of home awaited, she knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be.